Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of the series Dialogues with the European Union. I'm Raquel. I will mediate the debates of this episode on behalf of Dharma, and I will share the space with the representative of the delegation of the European Union, our dear Ambassador Inácio Ibañez. We will also have the honor to share the space and listen to the Swedish ambassador, Mrs. Johanna Brismarskog, the coordinator of ESPM Center for European Studies and Business, Professor Carolina Pavés, and finally, our special guest, Suelma Rosa, president of IHELGOV and co-founder of the group Women in Government Relations. A warm welcome to you all. Initially, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Inácio to welcome our guests and the audience. Inácio, please make yourself at home.
Many thanks, Raquel. Welcome, everyone, to the third webinar in the series Dialogue with the EU, Priority Agenda series. We are trying to keep our track record to be able to beat Netflix, as Creomar always said to us. And today, really, today's webinar, we have chosen a very important topic, Europe's role in combating violence against women, in light of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is marked annually on 25th of November. Every year, we are reminded that violence against women and girls is still widespread in the world. Indeed, the UN estimates that 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical or sexual violence. We have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased violence against women, particularly domestic violence. In Europe, we witnessed over the last year and a half an increase in contacts to helplines for gender-based violence, an increase in the demand for specialized support services such as emergency accommodation, and an increase of reports to police. Gender-based and domestic violence can even be quantified in terms of cost economic consequences. We know from a recently study by the European Institute for Gender Equality that the annual cost of violence against women in the European Union amounts to 289 billion euros. This is not an exhaustive figure and certainly does not measure the long-term psychological and human impact on affected women that is impossible to quantify. Tackling violence against women and girls and gender-based violence more broadly is therefore a key priority for the EU, both within the EU and in its external relations. I will tell you more in the course of the webinar. For now, allow me to add that I am very grateful to be able to count with such expert women's voices in today's webinar. Many thanks, Raquel. Over to you.
Thank you, Inácio. Thank you. So I believe we can now begin our discussion on Europe's role in combating violence against women, as Inácio said. So I invite our panelists to make their opening statements with a speaking time of 12 minutes each. At the end of this time, we'll move on to answering questions from the audience that is
I think we're having an issue with connection
so
in Brazil. I think it's a Brazilian issue.
Yeah. So I think, Joanna, you can start, please.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I
will perhaps introduce you, Joanna. Joanna is the ambassador of Sweden, very well known for me and for many of our colleagues in the EU delegation. But Joanna Brismarskog, she's a very talented diplomat here has been serving here for 2 years, almost and a half in Brazil. And she's really somebody with a lot of experience. And I'm very happy to have her today with us. Joanna, please, you have the floor.
No, thank you very much, Ignacia, and thank you for your very kind words. I'm very honored, and I'm very honored also to be invited to this discussion, because it's very important, and we need to remember to fight against violence against women, and not only this month and this day, but all through the year. As you know, the EU has 27 member states, and our challenges and solutions regarding violence against women is different in each country. But as members of the Union, we share the common EU vision and commitment to do all we can to prevent and combat sexual gender-based violence, support and protect the victims, and hold perpetrators accountable. I will first briefly speak about how the EU as an institution is combating gender-based violence, and I will then focus on my country, Sweden, and some of the challenges and successes that we'd like to share. We all know that gender-based violence is a major obstacle to the fulfillment of women's and girls' human rights. We also know that it's hindering sustainable and economic development around the world. Yet, as Ignacio also pointed out, 1/3 of all women worldwide are experiencing physical and sexual violence in their lives. Every day, women are victims of men's violence in their homes, on the labor market, be it formal or informal, or in other parts of society. Preventing and eliminating all forms of violence against girls and women is a precondition for the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights and achievement of gender equality, and towards a stronger, fairer, and more resilient society. Tackling violence against women and protecting and supporting victims and survivors is a key priority for the EU. We need to work on several fronts: legislation and policy, strengthening institutions and supporting individuals, promoting gender equitable attitudes, and enabling women and girls to be independent, not least economically. Gender equality is a core value for the EU and is central in our internal and external policy. Our common EU gender equality strategy from 2020 to 2025 frames the EU's work on gender equality and sets out the policy objectives and key actions. The EU engages on multiple fronts, and I will not go through all of them here because that would take all my time. But one example is the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative on combating gender-based violence, which this seminar is part of, and to which the EU contributed 500 million euros. In 2018 and 2019, the EU allocated over 60 million euros in humanitarian aid for the prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence worldwide. It's also estimated that 8.7 billion euros in development funding supported gender equality and women's empowerment in 2019. That is more than half of the total funding. The amount of funds committed that specifically target gender equality has increased every year since 2016, as has the proportion of these funds within overall development funding. And this shows in practice how the EU prioritizes these topics. I also believe that this common approach sends very important signals to all member states and to all men and women living in the European Union that men's violence against women is unacceptable and gender equality is a precondition. When it comes down to women's day-to-day life, however, it's the national legislations and norms and practices and implementation that can make a difference. As I mentioned, each of the 27 EU member states have chosen different strategies, and I would like to share some of the Swedish perspectives and examples. Sweden is considered one of the most gender equal societies in the world. We also have relatively low statistics on violence against women, even though it of course exists in Sweden as well. It has not always been this way. Conscious policy decisions, a lot of public debate, and active civil society and engaged business leaders have paved the way. Although many of the Swedish reforms have not focused directly on violence, working with gender equality in a broader sense, giving women voice, participation, economic independence, also promotes a culture where violence against women becomes less and less acceptable. But it takes time to change attitudes and to build resilient and solid institutions. Some of the key equality reforms are enabling women to have both a career and family by introducing concrete targeted instruments such as parental leave and affordable childcare, access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, non-discrimination and proactive gender action plans in the workplace, free education, including through university, and actively pursuing women's participation in politics and leading positions in society. Through the 3 R's, rights, resources, and representation, women are empowered to make their own choices and, for example, not forced to stay in abusive relationships or violent working environments. More women in politics is also key. When power is distributed more equally between men and women, violence statistics go down. In Sweden, 4 laws have been particularly important. The first one is abortion. That was legalized in 1938, but only then for humanitarian or medical reasons, similar to what is currently the case in many countries. Since the mid-70s, every woman can choose abortion until the 18th week of pregnancy. Now, the right for every woman to decide over her own body is not contested in the Swedish society at all. Prostitution law from 1999 made it illegal to pay for casual sexual relations. The penalty is a fine or imprisonment for a maximum of 1 year. What is interesting with this law, I think, is that it's the first in the world to make it illegal to buy sexual services, but not to sell them. The person selling sex is considered a victim, and prostitution as a part of men's violence against women. And just to make it clear, this law, of course, is about all prostitution, not only by women, but also boys and men. Prostitution, and therefore we see that the full responsibility for this violence, or gender-based violence, rests with the perpetrators. Prostitution is also seen to cause serious harm, both to individuals and to society. Lobbying by the women's movement laid the foundation for the sex purchase law. Female politicians had their male colleagues promote the law because they assumed more people would listen to them. Third, the law on sexual consent from 2018. This law states what should be the obvious. If sex is not voluntary, it is illegal. The initiative came after years of active work from civil society and women's organization. And with this law, it is no longer a requirement to establish that violence or threats were used to convict a perpetrator of rape, or that the victim's particularly vulnerable situation was exploited. If the victim did not give her or his consent to have sex, it can be considered a rape in a definition of the law. And fourthly, a new law from this year, the Child Protection Law, as I would call it in English. It does not have a name yet. This means that it's a punishable act to expose children to witness physical or sexual violence in close relations. For example, if parents are abused by the other parent. We know that many children grow up in violent homes, also in Sweden, and this legislation is trying to protect their rights. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is a Swedish law since a few years back, but of course we've been adhering to it for much, much longer. In Sweden, the Gender Equality Agency is responsible for implementing the government's policies on gender equality. The agency was established in 2018 to implement a 10-year strategy to combat men's violence against women, adopted in 2017. In this strategy, 2 factors are emphasized: the importance of preventive measures and men's participation and responsibility in the work against violence. So changing norms and new legislation must go hand in hand. Changing men's attitudes and behavior is key when it comes to addressing actual violence. And for this, we need to engage and involve men and boys in a discussion about their responsibilities, what sexual consent means, about power and abuse of power, masculinity norms. And we need to do it in the schools, in public debates, at home, around the kitchen table. The strategy also stresses the need for stronger protection for abused women and children, more effective law enforcement, and improved knowledge, approaches, and methods. To support the formulation of effective measures, gender-based violence has been defined widely by the Swedish authorities and include multiple actions with the purpose of forcefully or with threats retain power or control. In addition to the violence we usually think of when we talk about gender-based violence, such as physical violence, psychological violence, and sexual violence, the definition also includes, for example, material violence, economic violence, and digital violence. Some groups of women have been identified as particularly vulnerable, and these include people with disability and drug abusers, immigrants or people born abroad, LGBT, elderly, and young women and girls. And among the concrete measures we are working with is working with young men on stereotypes and masculinity norms, work against honor codes and introducing newly arrived and asylum seekers into the Swedish legal system and gender roles. Starting early with education on sex and cohabitation and respect in schools, working with sports movement on gender roles, and of course, crime prevention in general. The debate on violence against women is ongoing and very strong in Sweden. And in this way, the strategy is a living document. And just this past month, the government announced new measures to target honor-based violence, to strengthen preventive activities of regions and municipalities, and to increase next year's budget to intensify the work even more. So to conclude, we need to tackle all forms of gender-based violence, to actively involve men and boys, to strive to change the norms and attitudes, and most importantly, to continue to strive for the full and equal enjoyment of human rights by all women around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. Dear ones, I lost my connection. I'm sorry. But Ignacio, thank you for your help. But I came just in time to hear Johanna. So dear Johanna, thank you very much for such a brilliant exposition. And I invite our dear Professor Carolina to give her contribution to the debate. Carolina, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Raquel. It's a pleasure to be here in this actually very luxurious roundtable and discussion. Johanna, you almost made me feel like moving back to Sweden with your description of what's going on. And it's, well, I actually was thinking about changing my topics just to engage with you in this discussion, but I'll leave it to the end if we have some time left. But it's impressive that the measures you brought are very simple measures, and is actually, normally when we're here, the first defensive mechanism that we hear from politicians is that, well, this is a wealthy country, so they have the means to do that. But those are simple normative instruments that we can easily adopt and adapt to our reality, but very inspiring. So thank you for Sweden to be so progressive when it comes to advancing women's rights. And for my talk, well, I think we're all going to mention this World Health Organization data that 1 in 3 women suffer or will endure sexual violation in their lives. But 3 things that this pandemic has taught us or made us reflect. First is that online teaching is extremely exhausting, and I think we all agree with that. Second, that vaccines actually work. And third, that we live in an utterly unequal world. And this pandemic has somehow amplified pre-existing inequalities. So speaking about women, these inequalities were clearly exacerbated. So according to the 2021 Global Gender Gap Report that analyzed gender inequality across different indicators in over 156 countries, it will take us up to 135 years to achieve gender parity. And when we look at the specific indicators, the gap in political empowerment, for instance, will take us 145 years to close this gap and have equality in politics. And for those that think that the economic sector is less discriminatory than politics, well, then you're wrong. It will take 267 years for us to achieve gender parity when it comes to economic empowerment. So gender issues are not me. And my presentation will highlight some considerations on the role of the state, international organizations, and that includes the EU, and business when it comes to inequality. So making reference to the title of this webinar, and against this landscape, I would like to consider that inequality is a structural driver in a normalized act of violence that finds legitimacy in institutions like the state, international organizations, and business. And these actors are gendered institutions to the extent that they reflect and reproduce gendered social relations and inequalities through their policies, rituals, and practices. To attempt to portray market, the state, and even the academy as gender neutral serves only the purpose of blinding us from these obvious reproductions so that their bias towards misogyny remains unquestioned and therefore is perpetuated. This subject is obviously particularly delicate, as we cannot avoid making this roundtable and this discussion a personal one. So again, according to the World Health Organization, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence in their lives. That means that unfortunately, if we women in this room are lucky enough to avoid these statistics, we are very likely to know a victim. And the same applies to the men in this webinar. You probably know a victim or a perpetrator of sexual violence. When it comes to Brazil, 54% of rape victims age between 2 and 14 years old. That means that my 7-year-old daughter is more vulnerable to sexual violence than I am. In Brazil, sexual violence is actually the second most common form of violence against children between 0 and 9 years old. There are approximately 14,000 cases of domestic, sexual, and physical abuse per year in children. And in 65% of these cases, violence takes place at home. Feminists began to use the concept of violence against women in the 60s and the 70s, and this has reflected in domestic legal changes, especially in the 90s and the 2000s. And the pressure from feminist movements promoted reforms in their laws and in states to ban violence practice against women and girls. And as we have seen this case of success of Sweden, many states, including Brazil, have adopted specialized legislations, first to prevent and punish domestic violence, and then later to combat a broader range of violent and harassing practices. Yet, according to the World Bank, 154 countries in the world have adopted legislations against some form of sexual harassment. Often, these laws look very good in paper, but violence and harassment remains common. It's a reality that we face in our daily lives. So even if states with progressive legislations, we still see a different difficulty to influence citizens to comply with these laws, compel with state authorities, and ensure adequate allocation of resources for social support services. When we look into data of 24 countries, we're going to see that an average share of women victims who report gender-based violence to public institutions is only 7%. Reluctancy to report is attributable partially to the attitudes that see violence as normal, common, and private or family matter. Underreporting may also be strategic as women choose to avoid emotional, financial, and personal risks. And for those that report, when we look at data, for instance, in the UK, which is no longer an EU member state, but still matters, we see a drop over the past year. So with being a surge in the number of reports, but then conviction is less than 2.4% of the cases. So then why bothering and why facing all this violence again in going and reporting when the success case of your report is very low, it's less than 3%. And numbers in Brazil are very similar, right? So beyond that, if we want to discuss domestic violence, especially when it comes to EU and Brazil relations, it's crucial to highlight that we are connected by illicit activities such as human trafficking. According to the Commission, the European Commission, 72% of all registered victims were women, and women and girls are the vast majority, so 92% of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation in the EU. Brazil is among the most frequent reported non-EU country of origin for trafficking victims in Europe. Data from 2020 Trafficking in Person report shows also that transgender Brazilian women are one of the most vulnerable populations in the country. In 2019, 90% of transgender women in Brazil were in commercial sex. Child sex tourism remains a problem, particularly in resort or coastal areas. Many children in Brazil are victims of sex tourism, and tourists come mostly from Europe and the United States. But because of patriarchal and conservative structures of welfare states in many countries, women's, especially poor women, dependency on men become lifelong due to their caretaking responsibilities. There's a lack of regular income, adequate education and work skills, decent work opportunity, health insurance, and social security. Thus, women often do not have a say in determining their own lives. Such a dependency is itself a major contributing factor in male violence against women. Besides, efforts to increase female employment do not seem to have alleviated neither women's poverty nor domestic violence, mainly due to poor conditions in the labor market. According to the Global Gender Gap Report, since 2006, Western Europe is the region with a greater track of parity, so 77% on average, and one of the regions that has made the most significant progress over time when comparing. But when comparing 2020 to 2021, so we see here the pandemic, it will still take Western Europe 52 years to close its gender gaps. Latin America and Eastern Europe recorded a similar pattern. Economic empowerment is directly related to participation in the job market. Employment rates are systematically higher for men than women. In the EU, 67% of women are employed or were employed in 2019, compared to 79% of men. The situation is worse in the Mercosur, where the employment rate was 53% for women and 76% for men on average in 2017. Unemployment during the pandemic was greater for women than to men. Nearly 118 million women in Latin America are in poverty conditions, and this is 23 million more women in poverty than when compared to 2019. This data reveals solid economic inequality in the two regions, consequently placing women in a more vulnerable position regarding shifts in economic and trade policies and landscape. While it's often assumed that domestic and family violence at the workplace are mutually exclusive, and that one has nothing to do with the other. The domestic violence is actually a private or community matter, and that there's no role for business to play. Perpetrators of domestic violence regularly use the workplace as a further means to exercise power and control over their victims, often misusing their own employers' resources to pursue their abusive objectives of causing disruptions and traumas to colleagues. Moreover, access to paid work enables survivors to leave violent and abusive relationships and family situations. Indeed, impoverishment or fear of impoverishment is one of the reasons that victims and survivors of domestic violence often stay in violent or abusive relationships. Employment can therefore play a tangible role in assisting employees to transition out of domestic violence. But the market is also gender biased towards men. It is one of the most engendered institutions in which male privilege is disguised behind a discourse of meritocracy. Women account to only 8% of CEOs leading the 500 largest companies listed by Forbes. And in Brazil, half of women are fired from their jobs in up to 2 years after returning from maternity leave. That is when they can get a job, because most of women remain in informal economy. In addition, women's experience of gender cannot be separated from their experience of other aspects of their identity, of their access to resources, power, and privilege. So here I call for an approach to gender violence in this broad perspective under an intersectional approach that will call the attention to the fact that we cannot simply view an issue as one of either race or gender, for instance, but we must recognize that this is a problem that needs to take into account all parts of individuals' identity. And in this sense, intersectionality offers an important critique of systems and structures of power and how these interact with identity. It can actually be described as a complex ways that different identities overlaps and intersect with the structures. what this means is that different kinds of structural inequalities, for instance, because of racism, ageism, colonization and dispossession, or discrimination against people with disability, or discriminations based on sexual orientation and gender identity, are experienced differently when put together. I'm not just a woman, but I'm white as well, and I'm also a single mother. So all these identities, they overlap, and I cannot be framed just into one specific policy. And we also should not be seeing women as just a monolith. So this intersectional approach is needed to domestic policies and foreign policies approach. And since identities are shaped by social and cultural context, the EU also needs to be sensitive to different in terms of agendas and priorities. What we see sometimes is good intention, but it comes with a one-size-fits-all approach to foreign policy, in which the EU sets up its approach to, for instance, promoting gender equality and tries to transpose this to other countries without actually hearing them or being sensitive to these different needs and different perceptions of what gender means for a certain particular population. And finally, I also would like to go along the lines of what Sweden has been doing when it comes to foreign policy in general, which is promoting a gender mainstreaming approach. And here I would like to quote Williams and suggest that we should assume that gender is a cross-cutting issue. We shouldn't be discussing gender violence or gender in general just in this panel, but just gender should be an element present in any kind of discussion that we have. And the many strategies for that is not just discussing these issues, but also seeing, providing an opportunity for seeing these overlaps and how this agenda appears in all other topics of our debates, conducting assessments, engaging women in decision-making and in the monitoring and the implementation of the whole political procedure and policy-making process, not just seeing women as victims or passively awaiting for the state or the company or the international organization to show up as a savior that will rescue women from misery, but actually delegate as agency to lead this whole process of equality in our emancipation. And that's it. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you very much for your words and great contribution. I now invite our special guest, Swelma, to begin her presentation. Swelma, you are welcome.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Very hard to fill up to the level of my colleagues at the panel, but instead of jump into the gender-based violence, I would like to go back in history and navigate you through the entire movement we have been leading as females, not only us, but the other females before us. And why is that? It's because gender-based violence can only be fighted with gender equality. Gender equality is a basic human right. It says so at the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I don't need to remind you all that it's a document that we all, as a global community, agreed on in December 1948. So as it starts by saying that all human beings, it should include women, are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And it's hard to understand why in 2021 we are still discussing that. If it was written at the declaration so much back before, but we didn't stop there. Actually, we started much, much earlier. We can recall the suffragists, we can recall the feminist movement, we can recall, sorry about the noise, my neighbor decided to start some work today. I hope it doesn't interfere much. We can recall Simone de Beauvoir and the feminist movement But we should also remember that we have, as a global society, hosted a number of world conferences on women. Back 1975, before I was born, it took place the first one in Mexico City. In 1980, when I was born, it took place the second one at Copenhagen. After that, in 1985, we hosted one in Nairobi. And the latest one, 1995, when I was already in high school, we hosted one in Beijing. 25 years later, but last year, 2020, we should have taken the time to review the progress we had until now. But unfortunately, instead of moving forwards, we had setbacks. And those setbacks are related to the challenge women are facing throughout the pandemics. The pandemics obviously hits differently different societies. Inequality as a whole has been raised, but the lockdowns have put those us women, but also the children and also teenagers hosted or holded with their possible perpetrator. It's hard to understand why we are still debating all this in 2021 when I am already 41 years old and so many women before me has been working to promote gender equality. But let's move a little bit forward and go and jump to 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals brought the fifth development goal, which is gender equality. Can you only imagine that until 2006 in Brazil, we didn't have a legal framework to protect women against violence? Maria da Penha law, you may all be familiar with, was published, was approved in 2006. If you go through her biography, Maria da Penha is a biopharmaceutical. She was very successful in her career, and once she was asleep at home, her husband shot her, leaving her paraplegic for life. Wow, she navigated through a hard legal battle through Brazilian justice, but also decided to lead a movement that brought us the Maria da Penha law on domestic and family violence framework. Why is that so important? Because until we didn't have the basic concepts on what violence looks like, we couldn't address that as a country in terms of policy. And it was only by moving forward the international cooperation of gender-full development, only by introducing gender mainstreaming in all multilateral negotiations, although some of them are still facing a lacking behind in considered gender impact on their negotiation, on their designs. But it's not that only. By the year we had the SDG published and the gender equality addressed as the fifth objective, that was when the new legislation amends Brazil Penal Code to redefine feminicide. It's unacceptable that only in 2015 we had a specific concept on what violence and homicides based on gender-based violence looks like. Concept definition matters because that's when we name things and that's how we measure things. It's only when we measure that we can actually address its consequence, its negative effects. And why I bring all that? I bring all that because it's a shared responsibility. As I said in my early statement, we can only face gender-based violence when we reach a gender equal society. We are very far from that. And although we have all the capabilities in hand, although we have all the female leadership in hand, although we as female, we have been stick together in many groups, the professional or any other sort of supportive networks, we still have a long way to go. And that's why it matters. We are debating this today, but also it matters learning from those societies that has advanced gender equality. All that Ambassador Johanna has shared with us on how Sudan society has advanced gender equality give us some tips on what the road we should face ahead. And this road, it should address economic inequality, as Professor Carolina mentioned. It should address also the gender imbalance in workplace. It should address maternity leave and paternity leave. It should address what violence is about. We are not only talking about feminicide, and we are not only talking about sexual harassment. There's a number of different sorts of violence. And if you are not familiar with that, I invite you to go through the Maria da Penha law in Brazil that is very specific by defining what kind of violence and what violence is. The law defines domestic and familial violence against women, establish the domestic ways of violence against women, determine the violence against women is independent of sexual orientation of the aggressor, determines that women can only renounce representation in court. Monetary penalties are prohibited. It is prohibited to deliver of subemployment by the women to the aggressor, and so on, so on, so on. Although we do have in place a law, we do not have the means to make it effective. And that's where the relationship between European Union and Brazil comes into play. We can learn from their challenges. We can learn from the evaluation of and effectiveness of their public policies. We should deep dive on comparative politics to understand what is going on and what it's adapted to our society. But there's one step, a previous step we should do as a country that does not relate to our relations with the European Union, and that is we do have a male-dominant politics. It's not possible to advance any sort of public policy debate without having women at the seat to understand it, to bring their perspective to policy making, either in the legislative power or at the executive power. We have the lowest number of female ministers in this current administration. We need to address that as a country. And I would like to remember that we as citizens, we have a role in this. But luckily, the private sector has been doing some interesting agendas. And I would like to advertise a book we have just, it's not possible, yeah. We have just launched it at the Institute of International Relations. It's the first book about government affairs under the female perspective, and why we decided to do that. We had 17 professionals, female professionals, bringing their perspective on how hard it is to navigate through a male-dominant environment. Some of those articles share experiences on all sort of harassments, not only at home, but during their professional activities. There's nowhere to drive and to address those harassments that those kind of professionals face on daily basis by working on government affairs. And we face the same kind of challenges that the female representatives face, all sort of violence, even violence on social networks. That it's also a kind of violence. You may recall the article that Deputy Tabata Amaral published, only by naming all the harassment she have received on the social networks. So my first remarks, it's just to recall we have a long way to go, but we have those who have learned and implemented effective policies in their countries. European Union is certainly a base to compare, and we can learn together. We can learn from each other, and we can move and advance the gender equality agenda. Thank you so much, Raquel.
Selma, thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to hear from you. And to end this section, I invite Ambassador Banes to enrich our debate with his impressions on the subject. Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and really I would like to be brief because I'm looking forward to go to the part of the questions and answer, which is always an important part of any webinar. But perhaps allow me to say some comments on how we see the things from the EU. We have, of course, the excellent intervention by Johanna, the ambassador of Sweden, who already pointed to some of the elements. But I really want to insist that over the years, the EU has put in place substantial measures to put a stop to violence against women within the EU as well as outside the EU. Allow me, therefore, to mention some of the many policy documents and tools that we have at our disposal and which kind of measures we hope and expect can make a difference, and also starting to answer some of the questions we have got in our chat. First of all, actions within the EU. I think it's important that people here in Brazil understand that it really is a priority for all of us, and mainly, or I would say primarily, working inside the EU, as Johanna has said, putting the example of the EU, but also the very positive example of Sweden. One of the most recent measures that the EU has adopted has been the EU Gender Equality Strategy. This strategy covers the year 2020-2025, and we are therefore at an early stage of implementation, but it's really a work in progress that we are doing from this point of view. This gender equality strategy builds on previous EU policies and draws on past lessons learned. It aims to close the gender gaps that persist in the EU, and it's important to mention this, that we are very much aware of that, and we want to work to close these gaps. We believe that what we can have a positive impact is to focus on the fields of employment, equal pay, care, and pensions. The EU avoids seeing and treating women as merely the victims of physical and sexual violence. While we do help traumatized women with counseling and protective measures, we wish to prevent violence from happening in the first place, and we wish to empower women. Of course, effective prevention of violence needs, as it has been very well said by Johanna, also to focus on men and boys. This involves educating the youth from an early age about gender equality and respective and consensual relationships. We apply the same reasoning to our action outside the EU, and this I will go to the rest of the world and particularly to Brazil. As EU action worldwide, we try to address gender inequality outside the EU, and for that, the EU has adopted in 2020 a new action plan on gender inequality and women's empowerment in external action that covers the year 2021-2025. The Gender Action Plan 3 provides the EU with a policy framework with 5 pillars of action for accelerating progress towards meeting international commitments and a world in which everyone has space to thrive. This is worldwide the biggest investment that to achieve sustainable development goals, especially the objective 5, gender equality. And Latin America is a beneficiary, including countries like Argentina, El Salvador, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, and of course also Brazil. The EU engaged regionally with organizations such as the Organization of American States here in the region, the African Union in Africa, OSCE inside Europe, and ASEAN with our partners in Asia. So it's really a global effort that we are doing all over the world. Bilaterally, we also want to engage with non-EU countries on gender-based violence. We raised these topics in human rights dialogues. We raise it at political level with governmental representatives, we exchange with civil society, and we finance projects. In the case of Brazil, we are going to have our EU-Brazil human rights dialogues at the beginning of December. And of course, this is going to be a topic to be discussed. Also in Brazil, the EU is currently financing 5 projects to combat violence against women, with a total of EU contribution of about 6 million euros. For example, we have built a very solid partnership with UN Women, the body of the UN who deals with women, in a project entitled Connecting Women, Defending Rights, in which, amongst others, we also strive to contribute to the eradication of violence against women. We have had recently the visit of our High Representative, our Minister of Foreign Affairs for the EU, and of course he had contacts with President Bolsonaro, with Minister França, Minister Leici, the President of the Senate, but also it was a good opportunity to interact, I would say, especially with UN Women. As I said to you, it's a professional partner for the EU on these matters, and we had an excellent meeting in UN House here in Brasilia with UN Women and also representative of civil society, people who are working in this area. And this, I would say, is a constant element of our foreign action abroad. So whenever we have a visit, and this time this opportunity, a high-level visit like the one of the High Representative, women questions is always in the center of our action, and we devoted some time of the agenda of the High Representative in Brazil to do these things. More broadly, and since violence against women and the lack of economic participation are often linked, we also support a major initiative at regional level called Women's Economic Empowerment. And I think that we had an excellent presentation. We just now insisting on that this part of the empowerment of women is, of course, an essential element of our efforts in the country. And there in this program, we have been able to work with civil society, but also with the business community. I would say that the response from the business community, be it Brazilian or European, has been always excellent, and we have really found on them all the support that we needed. And I think it's very important that we do this work with the business community. They are very much moving on this line, and I think they can also mark the good examples on this area, what they are doing inside their companies, what other companies can do joining forces from this point of view. Allow me only to conclude by saying that the EU takes this issue very seriously and is present and active in Brazil, in Latin America, and in the rest of the world with this agenda, and of course, always ready to engage with Brazil as a whole, of course, with the government of Brazil, but also, and very particularly, with civil society, with the parliament, with the judicial system to work on this line. And I'm sure that now, during the time of the questions and answer, we will be able to elaborate a little bit more on this direction. So thank you very much, Raquel, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So I now turn to the questions from those who signed up via Zoom and YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for these questions. I'm going to identify the participants and read the questions in blocks of 4. I'm going to divide the questions among the 4 of you, but Johanna, Suelma, Carolina, and Ignacio, you are all welcome to answer as you please. So our first question is from Karen Alves, and she's asking, seen as Sweden is a pioneer and a role model in the fight against sexism, do you think strengthening the Brazilian-Swedish diplomatic relationship could help fight this issue in Brazil? I would like to ask the help of Johanna on this question. And the second question is, can you detail the role of the European and regional organizations, such as the European Union and the Council of Europe, in combating the violence against women? I think Carolina can help us with this one. The third question, I'm going to do the third question, and I'd like to ask for an advice as a young lady and a young professional. What can we do to change this scenario, and what is our role in this scenario? And I would like to hear from Suelma, and I'm sure that many other young ladies are watching us now, and it would be good to hear from you, Suelma. And our last question is from Beatriz Gagliardo. Are there any legal judicial mechanisms in European Union countries that seek to prevent this continuous violence, or what we call here abusive litigation, specific to cases of violence against women, or any other mechanisms that reduces this fear of suffering retaliation after denunciations? I think Ignacio could help us with this one. So I invite Johanna to answer our first question, please.
Thank you very much. No, this is a very good question. And in a way, we're already doing this. We're working actively with the government, with different Brazilian counterparts, both at federal, at state and municipality level, but also, as Ignacio also on the line and on the other speakers, with our business sectors. So, for example, just the Swedish companies here in Brazil, just last week, we had the first gender award ceremony, where they sent in very ambitious plans on how they will work on gender, or how they are working on gender, and examples on achievements that they've actually had. And we awarded them prizes for that. But it's, I think it's very important to do this job, as I said also in my introduction, all over. You know, it's not only government to government, it's multiple actors that need to be involved. We have a feminist government, and we have a feminist foreign policy. And one thing that we've done here is we translated this feminist foreign policy to Portuguese so that we can distribute it to those who are interested. We worked with Congress and the Senate on that one. And there's a great interest here to see how we can advance, or Brazil can advance, and learn from our examples and take the ones that fit into the Brazilian context, because not everything is adaptable to here. And we've done some mistakes too. And we've also been working with the Brazilian government on women, peace and security issues. And so there's a multitude of initiatives going on at the same time. Can this be strengthened? It can always be strengthened, but we're we're working very actively with it. So more of that, thanks.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Carolina, could you answer your question,
Yes.
please?
Okay. So the role of the institutions and how they can contribute to that. Well, there's sometimes an overlapping, but a cooperation between the EU and the Council of Europe. I feel a bit like constrained to not say anything wrong here, given the experts in the room, but we have to remind those of you who are not familiar with European institutions that we have two institutions. So the Council of Europe is not part of the European Union. It's an institution that encompasses 47 member states and addresses mainly human rights issues. So it extends, so it sees Europe as a more amplified perspective. So it has members, it has the 27 member states on board, but actually more 20 other non-EU member states. So it's more diverse than the EU when we think about human rights legislations and the status of human rights promotion across the Council of Europe. It has its own tensions, and we have been witnessing the difficulty to have states on board agreeing on many issues, but the same applies to the EU when we look at the policies in place. Well, we are looking at a successful case, which is Sweden, but then on the other hand, we have Poland and Hungary. They are representing the major backlashes when it comes to women's rights, and we're going back to medieval times in some women's rights in these countries. So also in the EU is not a homogeneous group. And even if we have EU's normatives and initiatives, but it's not an exclusive policy of the EU. So it relies on member states to apply, to adopt. The EU can set the guidelines, but they are also non-binding rules and strategies. There's incentive for member states to comply with this gender strategies, for instance, but in the end, it's up to individual national policies to advance these agendas with the support of the EU if they want to, and try to make something that provides a common ground for women's rights in Europe. But we have to be very careful when we discuss EU, when to not cross the line of competences and demand too much from Europe, even when we're talking about development policy or aid or foreign policy. In this case, the EU doesn't have that many force to be an independent partner and advance so much. Then if we compare with trade, for instance, which is an exclusive competence of the EU, so the EU has way more leverage to operate as an independent actor, independent from its member states. And then I would like to take chance and comment on something that Ambassador Ignacio was mentioning, which is the EU's strategy to support civil society. I think this has been crucial, and this is not a characteristic of the past years. We have been witnessing the EU adopting this approach to foreign policy in cooperation with Brazil, especially when it comes to human rights and environment, which I think is a very successful approach, instead of just addressing and working with the government, but actually directly engaging and empowering non-state actors. And I think I think you have probably been achieving more directly engaging with civil society than probably with the government, I assume. So I would like to commend you for this approach, which is especially in these times that social movements and civil society are facing a lot more difficulty than normal. Having foreign partners is crucial to keep us alive and trying to promote human rights in Brazil. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Carolina. So Alma, please make yourself at home to answer the question.
Thank you, Raquel. Well, my advice, it's very personal advice, is speak up. Speak up. You have us to back you up. We have the law to back you up. We have the entire international community to back you up. Wherever you are, you need to speak up. Otherwise, we are not going to change reality as it should be moving forward, gender equality. But more than that, specifically on gender-based violence, we have a saying in Portuguese, em briga de marido e mulher, ninguém mete a colher. I have no idea whether there is such an idiom in English, but the translation would be, in a quarrel between husband and wife, no one takes the scoop or something like that. Well, that's not true. We should intervene. And just last Monday, the government of São Paulo state approved a new law in which for domestic violence, the administration of the condominium is responsible to report violence against women, regardless whether it is hosted inside the house or in common areas of the condominium. This is such an important thing because we were raised not to interfere. And the only way we can protect those women, they are suffering or any sort of harassment, violence, it's by reporting. So speak up.
Thank you, Suelma. Thank you very much. Ignacio, please make yourself at home.
Thank you, Raquel. I will try to answer to the question of Beatriz Gallardo, but also I will refer to another Beatriz who also intervened in the chat with a very good comment, which is also touching a little bit on the issue. First of all, to going a little bit on the same line of Carolina, not trying to explain better what the EU is. The EU is, of course, an international organization. We are member states member of that, but we are also a supranational organization in which the member states have decided to give some of their part of what they can do, or they usually do, to do it for the group, so that we are doing. But there are limits to that. We cannot do, the EU institution, we cannot do everything, and it's good to be like this. There are areas in which the responsibility goes to the member states, and this part, the judiciary one, is a good example of that. It's very much more still under the member states' responsibility. This does not mean that the EU cannot say things, cannot intervene, or cannot make comments on that, but on the litigation part, it's much more member states. And there, I think Carolina has put some examples. There are some countries which I will say they go a little bit in the front. Sweden in this area is a very good example, and that's why we are very happy to have Johanna here. In other, they are going. But I think the fact that we keep moving, and we keep moving, I would say, on the right direction, makes also that the others who perhaps because of their own evolution or their way of doing things are a little bit ahead or on the back on these, they are moving. But I agree that Beatriz, sorry, this question is a very good one. We have to support women on these processes. We have to give, I think the answer to Suelma for the young lady applies to all ladies, all women. You have to speak up, and I think it's important. I think the public powers, they have the obligation to help the people, especially the women who are moving on this one. So I think there is a lot of work to do on this area, and I insist on that, because I would not like that the EU is perceived here in this debate as the example to follow. We have things in which we are fine, and it's good to follow the example, but we are many others, and in this one is also, we have still a lot of things to do, and I think it's very important that you understand that we are in a process, and we really think that we have many things to improve, and we have still figures which are, I would say, a shame on us about the violence against women. So this is the work, the example, to learn one from the other. It is something we have to do, and that's why I go to the other Beatriz Ascioli, who is somebody working in a private company, and she has put on the chat a very good example. No, she's speaking, and I'm reading what she says, speaking about the Avon Institute of Brazil, and it's a good example. Johanna has put other example of Swedish company. I also mentioned some example of other EU companies. that they are moving on this direction. They have created a corporate coalition to end violence against women. I think the example coming from companies is also very good, because it's where people are developing their lives, they're developing their careers, and to have, I would say, these efforts going from them. So of course, Beatriz, we are going to take on board your example, the example that you are doing that. We are going to join this with example of other companies. I think that this role, and there I go back to Carolina. Carolina mentioned the importance that we give to the civil society, and yes, it is true, because we are bound ourselves back home when we are going to present, or where we are presenting what the EU is doing. We always have to go in front of the civil society, and we always receive a lot of leadership from the civil society. So I think civil society in Brazil is very dynamic, especially on the defense and the promotion of the rights of women. So we are very happy to have this coalition with civil society. We are very happy to join the business community on this line, and I think that's the line that we have to keep working, and to join different, be it governments, be it companies, be it civil society organization, NGOs, to work on this direction. It's a common fight, I would say, a common battle that we have to do, and the more people we have on board, the better for our common objectives. Back to you, Raquel.
Thank you, Inácio. Thank you very much. Before closing, I would like to ask if our panelists would like to contribute with another answer. We still have time. So, Carolina, would you like to answer another one?
Well, I would like to comment on Soma's question, if you and take on that. My suggestion is not, I think sometimes throwing the responsibility at the individual level is a bit too much. This is a structural inequality, and that we face in our daily lives in many aspects of our daily routine, and major challenges that we face, be it professionally, be it in our family structure, be it interacting with police force, be it interacting with the judiciary system, and alone we cannot change this. So even if we make some noise, sometimes we are going to endure the consequences, especially if we're doing this individually, right? You're not going to change the structure alone. So my advice is support each other, stand up for each other, join forces. That's the only way. As a political minority, we're not minority statistically, but as a political minority, we can actually induce some change, create a network of women, and denounce in groups. And this, we have been seeing some results when it comes, for instance, with the Me Too movement as well, right? It's not just one woman speaks up and then others come along. So that's the only way we can move this structure and make some noise together and avoid individual consequences to the extent, even we're going to still face it. And inequalities in general, they're not going to change in our lifetime. I'm not going to, live to witness full equality. And I don't think my daughter will live in a full equal world. So history and change have a different pace than we would like to. But the importance is keep moving forward and don't bend your head, or just don't ignore inequality. See it everywhere, because it's everywhere, and stand up against it. And that's my advice. And thank you so much. It's been a great honor to be here this morning with all of you, and thank you for the audience as well.
Can I also just say some words on this as a last comment? Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. No, just to agree with actually both the speakers in this question, and also to emphasize again that we need to speak up as individuals, we need to speak up as a group and to support each other. But we also, and I keep coming back to this, we also need the involvement of men. There are so many good men out there, husbands, partners, friends, colleagues, all over. So we need to have them actively engaged on our side. We had the movement of active dads, showing that it is cool to be an involved dad in the family. We've seen young men now standing up for women's rights. And actually, if you think about it, coming back to the issue of violence against women, most men are not aggressors. They're not perpetrators. So most men are against this. So we need to engage them, to make them step out, and say their make their words and their voice heard, and to do this fight together with them, because then we're even stronger. If this becomes only a women's fight, we're not going to make it alone. But we need them on our side, and we have them mostly on our side. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carolina. You are great. And Swelma, would you like to contribute with another answer?
Oh, yes, please. My last remarks would be the role of private sector in this. We have mentioned the personal, individual level. We have mentioned the public policies at domestic and international level. We have mentioned the importance of the collective effort and the allies, but as my other hat at Unilever, it's also the private sector. I do believe that companies have a major role in this by advancing not only by complying with the regulation, but by advancing truthfully the diversity and inclusion agenda. I'm very proud to work for a company that is truly committed to it. Otherwise, I wouldn't join it. But this can be done in all levels, and I'd like to congratulate on Dharma Politics, for instance, that is a small company, but so much committed to diversity and inclusion. So we do have a role as private sector, and it should be leading the way, as we can learn from other geographies, as we can think by ourselves and introduce new approaches to promote gender equality. So that's my final remarks, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Stroma. Thank you very much. So before closing the episode, Carolina asked me to print the screen to save this moment and your participation here. So I would like to ask you to take a second to smile and look your best. Carolina, please.
Hold on. Oops, just a second. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Perfect. All smiling. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I'll send you the picture and then you can send it.
Yeah.
Share with the others.
My dear.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh.
Great discussion. Very interesting, and I'll look forward to continuing this. Absolutely, with our embassy and with our colleagues here. It's great.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we'll have to close the episode. It was great. I will give the floor back to our guests so they can say their final remarks if they wish, and goodbyes to the audience. Ambassador Johanna, if you want, the floor is yours again.
Yeah, just to thank you for organizing this, to have this important discussion, to have such engaged women and men around the table or on the screen. It's been very encouraging despite the situation around the world. So thank you so much for this, and good luck, Raquel.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It has been a pleasure to have you here with us. You are always welcome, and I really want to see you soon. I now give the floor back to Professor Carolina.
Well, I don't have, I just would like to thank for the company of all of you. It's been actually very inspiring, and I hope we'll continue the discussion here at the ESPM, but also outside and everywhere it's needed. So thank you again. And I'll see you next year for another round of dialogues, right?
Yeah,
just a spoiler. I have something to be looking forward.
It's true. Thank you very much for disposition and coming here and speaking for us. We see you soon. We will see you next year, as you said. Swelma, please feel free to say goodbye.
Well, only to say thank you so much for celebrating the 25th of November by advancing the debate. Thank you all. A pleasure to be with you, and hope next time alive.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes.
It was a pleasure to hear from you, Swelma. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Inácio, I give the floor back to you, and please feel free to close the debate as you may.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you all of you really for your insightful contribution and for your passion on this subject, which rightly so raises strong emotions. I want to recall what I said and others said also. This 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical or sexual violence. And I want to insist, in the EU, it is estimated that 33% of women were subject to physical and or sexual violence, while 55% were harassed. No country in the world is free of these unacceptable behaviors. And through the EU's gender equality strategy, the EU is therefore calling for legal measures to criminalize violence against women and EU countries. Through the Gender Action Plan 3, we are working together with our partners around the globe to promote gender equality. And we know that here in Brazil, we do have a strong coalition, and we are going to push on this side. So I really want to thank you, each of you, for being part of this event. It has been an excellent opportunity to reach a big group of people. I really want to go like Johanna on this line. I think it's a common work. Men and women, we have to work on this direction. It's really the task for the present, the task for the future, and we have to keep doing that. And really, the example that I have been setting to us today has been excellent. So thank you very much, all of you. It has been a pleasure to do also a new webinar to the Dharma. And if I don't say this at the end, I will have a problem with Creomar. So we are keep fighting against Netflix, and I'm sure that we're going to beat them. Thank you very much, Raquel. Back to you.
Thank you, Inácio. That's it. My dears, I thank you for this excellent episode. I'd like to remind you that you may find information about all the episodes on Dharma, European Union, and ESPM social media, and full episodes on Dharma's YouTube. Greetings to you all. It was great. Thank you very much.